Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We are very delighted that you could join us for this very important AAP dialogue session on race and ethnicity in Africa and the diaspora. Today's dialogue is being co-hosted by the African Studies Center, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the Department of African American and African Studies at Michigan State University, as well as the International Association of Universities. There are a few housekeeping issues we would like to bring to your attention as we start. French and Portuguese interpretation is available. If you would like to hear the interpretation, please choose the French or the Portuguese channel in the interpretation box or tab at the bottom of your screen. Please use the question and answer feature to ask panelists questions that will be addressed at the end of the dialogue. A recording of this dialogue will be shared with attendees later this week. Let me go on now to introduce myself. My name is Upenyu Maje. I serve as project manager for the Ubuntu Dialogues project, which is a partnership between the African Studies Center at Michigan State University and the Stellenbosch University Museum at Stellenbosch University in Cape Town, South Africa. I will be co-moderating the session with Dr. Cassandra Vini, who is professor and chair of the Department of International Relations at the US International University in Kenya. Dr. Vini will come in the second half of the session, and she will also facilitate the question and answer session or the portion at the end. This dialogue session is important for at least 3 reasons. Because of the persistence of racism around the world, but also because of the diverse perspectives that this forum presents on the subject. And then number 3, the lineup of distinguished presenters who will be sharing their perspectives on this subject. In our introductions of the presenters, it is not possible to do justice to their storied careers and their work. Also, it is not fair that we are giving each of them something like 10 minutes to speak to us. But if we would take time to read out their bios, that's all we are going to do in this session. So the approach that makes the most sense is to make the introductions short and let us hear from them and listen and then engage with them at the end of the session. Let me turn now to introduce the speaker for the opening, who is going to provide the opening remarks. Dr. Pero Dagbovi is University Distinguished Professor of History and Associate Dean in the Graduate School at Michigan State University. His research and teaching interests comprise a range of time periods, themes, and topical specialties. These include Black intellectual history, the history of the Black historical enterprise, Black women's history, Black life during the civil rights, Black power movement, African American studies, hip hop culture, and contemporary Black history. Dr. Dagbovi, over to you. Dr. Dagbovi, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the African diaspora right now. I thank the Alliance for African Partnership for the invitation to offer some remarks for this public dialogue series. From what I can gather, one of the goals of this morning's dialogue is to explore the nature of and responses to racial injustice in Africa and the diaspora and their particular reverberations in higher education. With this broad subject in mind, I'm going to briefly reflect upon the Black historical experience and the current and somewhat mainstream, formulaic, and oftentimes spur of the moment responses to racial injustice in higher education. African Americans occupy a unique place in the sprawling African diaspora. From the abolitionist movement to the civil rights movement to the Black Lives Matter movement, their culture, actions, and conditions have had consequences around the world. What this program pinpoints as racial injustice in the present US context has deep historical roots, dating back to the founding of the United States of America that was the byproduct of settler colonialism, Native American land dispossession, racism, and slavery. When conceptualizing the Black experience in the United States, racial injustice has been a constant thread. Since its earliest phases, the history of African Americans has been characterized by an enduring struggle for fundamental civil and human rights and liberation. The Black historical experience is characterized by a unique sense of human resilience. As law professor, columnist, and novelist Stephen L. Carter observed, quote, Black history is the story of an extraordinary people, a community that has survived all of the wickedness visited upon it over the past 400 years, a people who made a way out of no way, end quote. When we consider the non-monolithic Black experience and the experiences of other African descendants throughout the boundless diaspora, we come up against the challenge of maintaining a delicate balance between themes of victimization and oppression on the one hand, and perseverance and resistance on the other. In the tradition of Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black history, one needs to explicitly acknowledge and highlight Black agency as well as forms of resistance without trivializing the multitude of tragedies and setbacks that African descendants have encountered for centuries. The Black historical experience has profoundly shaped America's past and present. Throughout history, many happenings in Africa, the vast diaspora, and the world, such as the Haitian Revolution, colonialism, world wars, African independence struggles, and the anti-apartheid movement, just to name a few, have impacted Black Americans in meaningful ways and vice versa. African Americans are culturally an African people. As Molefe Kete Asante has emphasized, they represent a specific, discrete African ethnicity. Africanisms in Black culture are real and exist to this very day. Acknowledging a genetic, cultural, and spiritual connection with Africa, we should conceive of African American history as a history of an African people. This is what scholar Rusim Hamilton stressed. The first Black woman tenure system faculty member hired at Michigan State University in the late 1960s, Dr. Hamilton established a stellar reputation as a professor and member of the African Studies Center, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the Center for Advanced Study of International Development. An anti-apartheid activist, she was in 1979 appointed to the Commission on U.S. Policy towards Southern Africa. In the mid-1980s, Dr. Hamilton launched the African Diaspora Research Program that served as an interdisciplinary movement center for educating graduate students in Afro-diasporic studies. A founding editor of the African Urban Studies Journal, before her sudden death in 2003, Dr. Hamilton was working on an 11-volume book series on the African diaspora under the concept of routes of passage. Her research highlighted the global dispersal and settlement of peoples of African descent, far beyond the eras of the slave trade and slavery. Central to her approach was emphasizing connections between African descendants throughout the world, these intra-diasporic relationships, themes of migration and social mobilization, and of course, resistance to racism. Taking a prompt from Dr. Hamilton's framework for analyzing African descendants' existence in hostile and oppressive spaces, the Black historical experience in the United States serves as a useful case study for conceptualizing racial injustice. Generally speaking, the Black experience in the United States proper spans for 232 years and can be broken down into three phases: 1789 to 1865, 1865 to 1965, and 1965 until the present, whatever that might be in the future. During phase one, from the ratification of the US Constitution in 1789 until the abolition of slavery in 1865, the vast majority of African Americans were enslaved. The first federal census of 1790 reveals that there were 698,000 enslaved Black people, representing 18% of the total US population. In 1820, there were 1.5 million enslaved Black people in the United States. And in 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, there were approximately 4 million enslaved Black people. Slavery was arguably the most important defining characteristic of pre-Reconstruction era US history and culture. Black life during this first phase was centered on surviving, resisting, and abolishing slavery. The 100 years from 1865 until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was marked by Black struggles for basic civil and human rights. This phase consisted of various time periods and transformations, from Reconstruction to the long era of Jim Crow segregation to the modern civil rights movement. Though slavery was formally abolished at the outset of phase 2 with the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, during this century period of time, African Americans lived their lives as second-class citizens whose freedoms were limited by de jure and de facto segregation. Racial injustice was commonplace during this 100 years from 1865 to 1965. During phase 3 of the Black experience, the 56 years from the Voting Rights Act of 1965 until the present, African Americans have made notable progress. Symbolic high points have been the presidency of Barack Obama and the vice presidency of Kamala Harris. Yet, as we all know, the struggle against racial injustice, of course, continues. The existence of a post-racial American society is a mythology. Sparked by Black women activists, the Black Lives Matter movement is among the boldest expressions of the struggle against racial injustice since the days of the civil rights movement and the Black Power era. Now, several salient points are worth noting about this total Black experience. To begin with, the vast majority of the African American experience in the United States, about 77% of the total experience, have been lived in some state of overt struggle against racial injustice. It will not be until about 2140 that at least 50% of the total Black experience in the United States will have taken place since the passage of the Voting Rights Act, legislation that symbolically gestured the end of the modern civil rights movement. Historicism and thinking historically teaches us that contemporary expressions of racial injustice are to some degree spin-offs from various pasts and bygone days. Pressing issues such as reparations, restorative justice, mass incarceration, political disenfranchisement, immigration laws, economic disparities, residential segregation, anti-Black thought, and police brutality against Black people all have historical precedents. In the aftermath of the police murder of George Floyd, in late May 2020, colleges and universities nationwide have been issuing all sorts of social justice statements, creating task force, and initiating anti-racist training. Echoing the responses to the Black student movement of the 1960s and 1970s, university leaders have been scrambling to respond to racial injustice on and off campus. In higher education, racial and ethnic diversity initiatives are often the byproduct of controversies, incidents, and crises. As one scholar has counseled us, quote, meaningful diversity work cannot be seen as something that is supplemental or remedial, or touted only in times of crisis or promotion. Diversity is not philanthropy, end quote. In higher education, cycles of normative reactionary approaches to diversity and social and racial justice date back to the turbulent 1960s. Measurable headway has certainly been made through the decades. Still in all, particular historically rooted trends still persist. In the past year or so, the terms anti-racist and especially social justice have been variously evoked in higher education. According to the United Nations, quote, social justice may be broadly understood as the fair and compassionate distribution of the fruits of economic growth, end quote. Now, most universities do not adhere to this definition. Instead, they seem to conceive of social justice as broadly meaning, like equity, equal rights and equitable opportunities for all. Recent critics of the concepts of social and racial justice in higher education have claimed that it opens the door to celebrating social activist professors, that it politicizes the dissemination of knowledge and challenges the glorious narrative of American democracy. This was evident with the conservative backlash to the 1619 Project and the former president's attack on critical race theory and the banning of diversity training programs. The 21st century challenges to racial injustice in higher education have resurrected debates that were commonplace during the culture wars of the 1980s and 1990s. University communities are currently wrestling with how to interpret social justice and address racial injustice. Some universities have evoked racial justice with their renaming of buildings and apologies for past behaviors, as well as in their curriculums, centers and institutes, and hiring initiatives. A handful of universities have even dubbed themselves anti-racist institutions, perhaps taking a cue from Ibram X. Kendi, the author of the New York Times bestseller, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Some universities, on the other hand, have been deliberately cautious to confront racial injustice head-on, while strangely and simultaneously expanding conceptualizations of diversity to include, for instance, diversity of ideas and thought styles. Coinciding with the COVID-19 pandemic, the past year has brought discussions of diversity and inclusion, social justice, and racial injustice in higher education to the forefront. As a historian of the Black experience, I have noticed that there has also been a tendency to broaden the concept of diversity, so much so that in many cases, members of traditionally underrepresented racial and ethnic populations, especially African-descended people, have been further marginalized. There have been countless turning points in the long Black struggle against racial injustice in the United States. With the risk of sounding presentist and ahistorical, we seem to be at a moment and a monumental crossroads in terms of higher education's face-off with racial injustice. When we return to the new normal in higher education, whatever that might entail, hopefully the current momentum does not fade away. Those with the power to do so in our respective institutions have great opportunities to continue to embrace and operationalize restorative and transformative diversity initiatives and tackling racial injustice in the realms of our teaching, research, service, and outreach. Let me end with a quote from Black internationalist Ida B. Wells, who spent her adult life fighting against the most blatant forms of racial injustice. Ida B. Wells wrote, quote, "There must always be a remedy for wrong and injustice, if we only know how to find it," end quote. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I know that the ensuing dialogue will surely have much to offer us today from a variety of perspectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Doug Bovey, for your presentation. Just as a reminder, if you have any comments or if you have any questions for the panelists along the way, please use the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. The comments and questions will be addressed at the end of the dialogue session. Our next presenter is Dr. Jabba Bennett. Dr. Bennett serves as Michigan State University's Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer. He is also a professor of medicine in the College of Human Medicine at Michigan State University. His presentation is titled "From Bondage to Restraints, Historical and Contemporary Barriers to Higher Education in the US." Dr. Bennett, over to you. You have 10 minutes.
Hello, and thank you so much for the introduction and for Dr. Doug Bovey for that wonderful history. Could I have the next slide, please? So I'll be talking about from bondage to restraints, historical contemporary barriers to higher education in the US. Next. I'm going to focus on three areas. I won't go into the detail that Dr. Doug Bovey did, but I want to acknowledge the plight of the African American here in this country and in higher ed, talk about the path forward, moving beyond statements to create meaningful change, and then a bit about Michigan State University approach. Next. So the plight of the African American. I think it's important to realize and even visualize a bit of the experience, and not to minimize it, but as you heard Dr. Bowlby talk about, from slavery to the treatment and unfair treatment of slaves, to the treatment of freed individuals, slaves in this country, to segregation, and even today, to the last image at the bottom that says, "I can't breathe," which represents the circumstance which took the life of George Floyd, which kicked off a lot of activities here in the US and around the country related to racial justice. I wanted to start with providing that context to acknowledge that we have to understand where we've been and where we are in order to effectively address the challenges that continue to face many African Americans and folks across the diaspora. Next. 400 years of slaves. This is a diagram that just talks about the period of American slavery in this country, the period of segregation, and sort of where we are now. Many injustices continue to exist. Several were outlined by Dr. Bowlby. But again, it's important to acknowledge where we've been, what our experience has been, and the fact that today there are still restrictions that can hold Black people across the world and African Americans in some type of restraint as it relates to their attainment of higher education and various opportunities that universities can provide. Next. So the path forward, how do we move beyond statements to create meaningful change? Next. I think there are 5 areas that I'm going to focus on here. I'm going to talk about why diversity matters, the need to eradicate racism and share some steps toward that, the need to promote anti-racist education, give you some examples, and then 2 steps specifically that land-grant institutions should take to fight racial injustice, and lastly, ways to drive what I call inclusive excellence. Next. So why does diversity matter? Diversity helps to breed excellence and creativity and innovation, whether it's a thought and a representation by race, ethnicity, gender, and so forth. Next. It also helps to broaden the scope of inquiry that we conduct within the university setting, work that's done to address disparities in health, broad disparities in education, but also differences in the experience of people who may be different sex or various gender identity or expression. Next. Diversity matters in the way that we approach it in colleges and universities because it considers the changing demographics of the nation and the need to educate everyone, and also to, as a public institution, in our case, Michigan State, think about how the diversity of our students and our faculty and staff reflects that of our local environment across the state and even the nation. Next. Diversity also helps to improve the quality and efficacy of the teaching activities that occur, clinical care that we deliver to patients, community health broadly, but also outcomes even beyond that. And last, ultimately, if we do all these things, you can click the next one for me, we will achieve inclusive excellence, this intentional effort to ensure that we diversify, that we treat people fairly, provide access to various opportunities as well. Next slide. So the 4 steps to advance anti-racist, diverse, and just democracies locally and globally, as recently shared by some colleagues, is that redesign of universities to focus on the development of students who help create anti-racist democracies around the world should be a focus, along with reimagining the Knowledge Project, incentivizing and rewarding student, faculty, and staff efforts to take on those issues in interdisciplinary ways, listening to and in partnership with local communities. Consider a change of ownership of the university, commit to serving as vital bridges between societies, and as multilateral organizations using their vast resources and positions of privilege to advance social justice. And lastly, get the values right. Promote open inquiry, diversity and inclusion, democracy, equity, and justice. Next. And think about 8 actions to reduce racism in the classroom. Recognize your implicit biases and remediate your racial illiteracy. Don't be surprised when a Black male student writes well. Stop expecting the Latina student to speak for all Latinos. Quit thinking all Asian American students are the same. Be aware that stereotype threat may be occurring among some students of color. Meaningfully integrate diverse cultures and peoples into the curriculum. Responsibly address racial tensions when they arise, and recognize that you and your faculty colleagues share much responsibility for racial inequities that exist. Next. and 2 steps that land-grant institutions such as Michigan State University could take to fight racial injustice. Number 1, recognize and recompensate the transgressions committed against Native American tribes in the building of our institutions, and also form more intensive partnerships with sister historically Black land-grant universities. These were institutions that were created and mandated to be created to educate Black people after they were freed and emancipated from slavery, because as it was then made legal to educate Black people, it was decided it could not be done and should not be done in the same spaces and institutions as white individuals in this country. Next. So I want to talk about our approach to this work. Next slide. There are many ways to drive inclusive excellence, as I've talked about before, an intentional process, working with students and trainees around targeted diversity initiatives, enhancing inclusion through tools such as climate surveys, providing spaces for people who identify in various ways to come together, promoting student and trainee success through funding, through mentoring, through professional development, and improving outcomes by tracking progress that we're making in the recruitment of students and trainees, their advancement, and their outcomes as well. For faculty and staff, very similar. Think about strategic partnerships with organizations where potential faculty could be recruited, create our own programs, for example, postdoctoral trainee positions, where prospective faculty may be retained and hired into teaching positions at our institutions. Around enhancing inclusion for faculty and staff, again, a singular climate survey that faculty, staff, and students receive is a wonderful idea to get a baseline about the experience of these individuals on our campuses and what we can do to move forward. Around promoting success for faculty and staff, how we provide funding that can support the work and activities of a faculty member, for example, that may bridge between when one funding source may be running out and the other has yet to arrive or be secured. How can we incentivize innovation and diversity, equity, inclusion by providing awards and grant funding as well? And lastly, to improve outcomes, continue to track and monitor progress and have people to advise on what innovations and interventions should occur. Next. So I'll talk about 2 specific initiatives at Michigan State before I close. First, the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Steering Committee, which was charged by the president of our institution to look at work happening broadly across the entire institution, all of our colleges, schools, and to aggregate feedback and to get input from people on campus about what we're doing well and where the gaps are, what opportunities might there be. It's important in this work to also think about recommended actions and associated metrics, and also forums for accountability. Next. This work was chaired by a couple of faculty members and faculty and staff across the institution. It included over 26 faculty, student, and staff members with other advisors. And the work took place over a course of 15 months, engaging various work groups that were part of the planning, but then over 53 listening sessions and more than 400 people across the entire institution. And out of this process, more than 200 recommendations were emerged. Next. So please continue. The major things that came out of this work were that we should increase diversity, ensure equity, promote inclusion, and enhance outreach and engagement. So we are working toward that. The next steps, you can see they're listed at the bottom. Next slide, please. I'll quickly tell you about the Task Force for Racial Equity, which emerged in summer of 2020 after the killing of George Floyd. And the president thought it was important for us to think about how we help to ensure campus climate and safety, faculty and staff diversity, as well as policing. Next slide. There were 3 committees that worked to address these issues, as I mentioned. And the first one on campus climate and safety looked at how could we acknowledge that immediate actions alone won't remove the systemic barriers to effectively advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and several recommendations that you'll see listed here emerged from that group. Next, the second group looked at faculty and staff diversity. How can we train and support faculty of color? And recommendations emerged around expanding hiring efforts, longer-range issues also around the importance of data collection and gathering information and doing additional research. And the last group, policing, thinking about how we can support a safe and welcoming and respectful campus climate for all. And this has a lot to do with the interactions that police in this country have had with Black people and people of color and what those outcomes are. So we made recommendations around expanding our inclusion and anti-bias unit, looking at overall budget and services provided by the police department, looking at different types of oversight and accountability, and emphasizing safety and service. And lastly, next slide, here's where we are, exploring those recommendations, thinking about implementation as well, and this work will continue through the summer. Happy to discuss more during the Q&A, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bennett. Moving on now, our next presenter is Dr. Norman Duncan. Dr. Duncan assumed the position of Vice Principal, Deputy Vice Chancellor for Academic at the University of Pretoria on August 1st. He holds a professorship in psychology and is the former Dean of Humanities at the University of Pretoria. The title of his presentation is Race, Racism, and the South African Higher Education Sector. Dr. Duncan, over to you, and you have 10 minutes as well.
Thank you very much. And thank you too for the organizers for having invited me to participate in this dialogue session. When I was invited to do this input, I was undecided about whether I should speak about the incidents of racism and xenophobia to which particularly Black academics and students have routinely been exposed in South African universities over many decades, or whether I should speak about the racial paternalism still glaringly evident in certain contexts, or indeed whether I should speak about racial privilege. All of these are, of course, topical issues. Now, given that much has been written on these issues in recent years, and given the brief given to me by the webinar organizers, I eventually decided to focus this brief presentation on the enduring effects of institutionalized racism at South African institutions of higher education. Next slide. Because I believe that it is important to understand the antecedents of the way in which issues of race and racism play themselves out in higher education in contemporary South Africa, I want to use 1957 as the point of departure for this brief input. Furthermore, I want to use available statistics as a key anchor for this presentation. Slide 3. In 1957, approximately 22,000 students were enrolled at the 9 South African universities in existence at that time. A mere 1,300 of these students were Black. At the time, Blacks constituted approximately 80.7% of the general South African population. Now, during that period, Black students could enroll at Fort Hare University and 3 universities that catered predominantly for white students, namely the universities of Cape Town, Witwatersrand, and Natal. It should be noted, however, that these 3 historically white universities accommodated Black students in very limited numbers. Furthermore, while they allowed Black students to attend lectures, they enforced strict racial segregation policies as far as residences and sporting and other recreational activities were concerned. Thus, the South African government and most South African universities at the time rendered the attainment of university education by Black people in South Africa not only extremely difficult, but also abjectly dehumanizing. Slide 4. However, worse was yet to come, because in 1959, the National Party government of the day passed the notorious Extension of University Education Act. With the passing of this law, absolute racial segregation at all universities in South Africa was to be strictly enforced. Indeed, this law was to make it a criminal offense for any Black student to be enrolled at any university that was designated as a white institution. A number of alternative institutions of higher education, labeled university colleges, were subsequently established for Blacks. Of course, these criminally underfunded university colleges, which in the 1970s were recategorized as universities, were designed to be inferior in all respects to the universities designated for the exclusive use of white students. And because of the patent racism reflected in these arrangements, universities designated for use by Black South Africans became the sites of intense and ongoing protests against the racism of the old apartheid order. Indeed, much turbulence, particularly at Black universities, characterized the higher education sector in South Africa between 1959 and 1994, when the first non-racial democratic South African government was installed, a government that explicitly committed itself to non-racialism. This commitment was later enshrined in the South African Constitution. As far as higher education was concerned, this commitment was given further substance by the promulgation of the Higher Education Act of 1997. Slide 5. The Higher Education Act repealed a range of apartheid-era laws that were established to ensure the subjugation of higher education to the ideals of white supremacy. Importantly, the Act mandated the restructuring and transformation of institutions of higher learning so that they could, and I quote, redress past inequalities, provide equalized opportunity, and better respond to the needs of South Africa, close quote. Now the question can be asked, how has South Africa fared since the 1990s in relation to this injunction for universities to redress past racial inequalities? Consideration of the available statistics is instructive in this regard. Firstly, how has the situation of academics changed since the 1980s? Slide 6. Well, by 1992, due to the machinations of the old apartheid order, white academics constituted 87% of all instructional and research staff at South African universities, while Black academics made up a mere 13%. As indicated in slide 6, by the year 2000, that is 6 years after the installation of the first democratic government, this picture had improved slightly, but only slightly. However, as indicated in slide 7, if we can move to slide 7, by 2019, the ratios had improved significantly, as you can see. Now, systemic interventions by the South African government and various interventions by individual institutions, student movements, and other pressure groups had much to do with these changing demographics. While the significant improvement in the representation of Black academics in the academic staff complement of universities has to be recognized, it also has to be acknowledged that the profile of academic staff at universities in South Africa currently remains fundamentally problematic. That is, if South Africa's general population demographics are considered. It has to be remembered that Blacks currently constitute 92.1% of the total population in South Africa. So having only 56% of your academic population being people of color poses a problem, because that is disproportionate with the general population statistics. Thus, per capita, Black academics, it should be emphasized, remain significantly underrepresented in the ranks of university instructional and research staff. More worryingly, Black African women or Black women are the most underrepresented group in academia in South Africa, in that they currently constitute a mere 16.1% of academics in South African universities, while they constitute 40.4% of the general working age population. Moreover, it will be noted that Black academics are still significantly underrepresented in senior academic positions at South African universities. For example, a recently published report indicates that close to 55% of all full professorships in South Africa are held by white academics. At a few universities, the outliers, the percentage of Black academics with full professorships decreased to something in the order of 20%. How has student participation in university education changed since the changes of the early 1990s? Well, if you can move to slide 8. In 1994, white students constituted 41% of all students enrolled in institutions of higher learning in South Africa, while Black students constituted 58.7% of all registered students. By 2019, however, Black students constituted approximately 88% of all students registered at South African institutions of higher education. Currently, student demographics, therefore, are clearly less racially skewed than the demographics for instructional and research staff at South African universities. However, it has to be noted, the differential pass rates for white and Black students are glaring. Indeed, it is at this level that we most clearly see the enduring effects of institutionalized racism on university education in South Africa. One has to acknowledge that many of the difficulties experienced by students at university originate in their communities of origin, and those communities of origin are still hugely impacted by past practices and specifically past racist practices. Now, much has been written about the continuing effects of the old apartheid order on higher education in South Africa. In this regard, I want to flag the two reports on slide 9. If we can move to slide 9. Now, both reports deal at length with the experiences of Black students and academics at South African universities of higher learning and the negative impact of these experiences on students' chances to succeed in their studies and academics' chances of career progression. It should therefore not have been surprising when countrywide student protests broke out in South Africa in 2015-2016. The key demands of students at the time related to the problem of enduring racism in higher education, the decolonization and democratization of South African universities, and free university education. If anything, the 2015-2016 student protests demonstrated that while much had been achieved in South Africa to address the noxious legacy of the racist apartheid order, much more work will still have to be undertaken in order to establish a more just, equitable, and non-racial higher education system. I conclude with a recent observation by Kahinde Andrews, next slide, which I find apropos. Racism, he says, racism in universities is a systemic problem, not a series of incidents. To combat racism, universities need to overhaul the structures that perpetuate them. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duncan. And I would like to hand over now to my colleague, Dr. Cassandra Bennett, to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is, and I hope I'm getting her name right, is Professor Fumi Olanisaken. I hope I got that right. She is Vice President and Vice Principal. She is Vice President and Vice Principal International and Professor of Security, Leadership and Development at King's College London, and she is one of the founders of the African Leadership Center. So again, each person has 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Cassandra. Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's lovely that I have come right after Professor Norman Duncan because I can see the consistency in the issues that we'll be discussing. Let me just put an argument on the table, and that argument is really like this. It's that the very institutions globally, regionally, and nationally that are expected to mediate difference and therefore ensure equality and justice are invariably the very vessels through which structural inequalities, particularly racism, if you like, and ethnic discrimination, they're the vessels through which this persists. Universities are not excluded anywhere in the world, and no exception here. And that's the crux of the matter that has brought us here today. Then let me provide a little bit of context globally, since I said global institutions are part of this, this question. Look at the deep-seated division that exists at the United Nations on the questions of race. 20 years ago, whilst at the United Nations, myself, almost 20 years, it was September 2001, South Africa hosted in Durban the conference on racism, United Nations Conference on Racism. I returned to New York, the following week was 9/11. It is sad to see that almost 20 years to the launch to this particular conference I'm talking about, and the various General Assembly efforts to bring the question of race equality to bear in a way that serves the world well. We saw how on 31st December 2020, you saw a vote at the United Nations, all right? This particular vote would occur from time to time, but in the year that George Floyd was killed, was murdered, this was how the vote that sought to deal with questions of race equality at the United Nations stood. 193 members voted, all right, on this question of ensuring of anti-racism. That's how I'll summarize it. It's there online for people to see. The General Assembly voted yes, 106 countries, no, 14 countries, abstentions 44, non-voting 29, all voting members 193. Now, some of those who voted against it were the USA, UK, Australia, Canada, Israel, France, Germany, Netherlands. Major European countries voted no. The rest of Europe abstained. But funny enough, Nigeria, the most populous Black nation on earth, abstained. You have to ask questions around why the very issue of racial injustice has to be politicized in this way. In the year that Black Lives Matter movement really dominated the discourse globally, all right? And that's part of what you would think the role of universities would be in terms of addressing this issue. But I want to put at the center of this, of course, as Cassandra was saying, my day job is to be a professor of peace and security. The question of peace is one that I try to grapple with in every single context. So if you look at the work of Johan Galtung and that ABC triangle of many decades ago, constructed to really explain the foundations of peace and justice, but actually the foundation of equity, because if you want to address unequal life chances, you have to revisit what he calls attitudes. That's the A. Norms, values, beliefs, and culture that determine the basis of societal behavior and interactions. You also have to therefore look at the B, the behavior, because I can behave to you on the basis of the belief that I think you are inferior to me. This is where the question of race and of course class and gender will come into it. And context matters. That context has to do with the laws, policies, systems, leadership questions, and how people behave and approach each other. If you punish it severely, maybe it will not happen again, you think? But at least the context says a lot. So that's a global context I've just tried to paint there. But the main point of all of this, which is why the higher education space is what we're talking about, is that universities themselves are a microcosm of the context in which they exist. So, but at the same time, they're supposed to have the power and the influence to transform that context. So the question of the social contract that exists between universities and the societies within which they're embedded is always at play here. So, but of course, those societies and the ways in which our universities have been shaped, they are rooted in age-long attitudes, therefore, and behaviors that are underpinned and characterized by power dynamics that are racialized, they're gendered, they're class-based, and they're mediated, of course, as we heard from the keynote speaker, and some of the other colleagues, they're mediated by colonial domination in many places, manifesting themselves in many ways. We know of the US experience and it says something, but the South African experience that we've just heard about from Professor Duncan begins to reinforce the manifestations of this across different countries. And many of us here are no stranger to Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality. We have to take all of this at once. And the race question is locked firmly in the question of inequality and injustice around class, around gender, if you like. So what do we do? Do we deal with my race today and then my gender tomorrow and my class tomorrow and the day after? Unless we lock these things tightly within the university system, we cannot deal with them effectively. And I'm not sure the extent to which we can begin to deal with these manifestations unless we're really serious about dealing with the structural roots. And what are those manifestations? Very quickly in headline form, they have to do, at least in my context, with Black and minority students who are the bulk, of the increasing population. Of course, when I say the bulk, I don't mean the total university population, but in the same way you're talking about 14%, 8%, 10, 12%, you also find outside of our own country, outside of the UK, many more international students coming from different backgrounds. But whilst that is increasing, the question of the representation of the very Black and minority people in university leadership, in, if you like, the professoriate, that remains stagnant. Like Professor Duncan said, that's what you find in much of our universities in the United Kingdom. In my case, I am the only Black woman in senior most leadership. And I don't know how that will change for some time to come if the pipeline is not there to really begin to bring more people in. So what is celebrated and glorified on our campuses, you've seen it to different degrees. The question of status of, of people whose history might be immersed, in not just colonialism, but also slavery in particular. Curriculum that bears little or no resemblance to the lived experiences of Black people and minority peoples everywhere. Attainment gaps, Professor Duncan spoke about that as well. The fact that it's almost guaranteed that a Black student has, is 10 times as, is not going to perform. It is, twice, 10 times as likely, depending on where you're talking about, to perform less than the white counterpart. And of course, that has structures that predate university experience. The sense of tokenism for Black university leaders, of course, and this is at odds. The fact that I'm a university leader is at odds with the mental model that people have. So many will see me in another campus and wonder, are you really vice president of your whole university, King's College London, or your faculty? Or are you the head of diversity and inclusion? Because that's all that Black people represent. So let me begin to, let me wind down really by saying, though, that the sad thing is that in African countries themselves, there's unfortunately a close connection between that university structures and the discriminatory practices elsewhere. So most have retained the power dynamics that shaped colonial institutions, the very institutions that they inherited. So unless we recognize this history, and many universities are beginning to do that, but we're nowhere to closing those gaps, because you can replace those things I've just said. In some instances, you can replace race with ethnicity. So in reversing these trends, I think that reversal must be found in a collective struggle or fight against, if you like, the very dynamics, the very systems. But how do we do that? Collective policy making to address this representation question at professorial level and university leadership, all right? I should have also mentioned earlier that the question of the curriculum that bears little or no resemblance to the lived experiences of Black and minority people has to change. So therefore, as we work together, westernized curriculum that do not reflect indigenous knowledges and the worldview of people of color and minority ethnic groups must be tackled collectively by all of us. And therefore, it means that the traditional unequal partnerships between universities in the global South and in the global North, where some of the ideas that we've just heard, some of these issues are embedded, will have to change fundamentally. What we have is a work in progress, all right? But this 21st century period represents a moment of opportunity to transform the status quo and not just make incremental change. I'll leave it at that. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And our next speaker is Dr. Anna Pinto, who is a professor at the University of Brasilia. Welcome. Professor Pinto?
Yeah, ok. Good morning, bom dia ou boa tarde a todas as pessoas presentes. Eu gostaria de agradecer por essa oportunidade de diálogo, especialmente a doutora Jose Jackson Mallet e Leonora Paula, que me fizeram o convite.
Invited me. It's an honor to be here, even virtually. I'll call attention to the fact that according to data from Brazilian statistics,
I have a presentation. I don't know if you received it. Can I share? Okay, thank you. Okay. De acordo com
according to the Brazilian statistics, 54% of the Brazilian population is Black. that represents about 114 million people. Because the national elites have tried to deny racism, the inequalities produced in daily practices of racial discrimination were naturalized by society. This week, we are celebrating 130 years of the end of slavery. And Brazil has had a difficult time overcoming those narratives. The objectives, I would like to call attention to Law 12711 from 2012, the quota law. So it was result of the Black movement effort to increase the interest of Black students in federal public institutions in Brazil. It was established under the presidency of Dilma Rousseff.
Secretaria de Políticas de Promoção da Igualdade Racial, a CEPI. Próximo. Fruto de uma acirrada disputa.
This law was the result of a discussion and
em que estava em diálogo direto na verdade, que estava em jogo o direito ao ensino superior, não apenas para pessoas brancas.
Fight of the access for the higher education. So this law represented an opportunity for access to all and to democratize the access to higher education in Brazil. Up, next slide, please.
Next, please.
Next slide, please.
No, before.
The one before, go back, please.
This, okay, thank you. Isso fica bem assinalado, por exemplo, nesses artigos.
This is evident, for example, in Articles 1 and 3 in the quota law that reserves slots for Black, Indigenous, and people with disabilities. Next slide. The law, so this law rendered the Ministry of Education responsible for monitoring and evaluate the program by this law. So within 10 years after the publication of the law would have to be revised and assessed.
Bem como aqueles que tenham cursado integralmente
to assess the results of the access of not only Black students, but also Indigenous and students coming from public schools.
Apesar de vivermos sob governo que tem dado inúmeras.
Even though we live under a government now that is intent on reversing those rights. Next slide, please. So we need to question, we need to answer a question. What gains
made as a result of Brazil's affirmative actions policies in higher education? Next, please.
Next.
Durante o governo do presidente Lula e
so under Lula's government, Dilma Rousseff, there were a series of programs established to open access. So highlight is the plan to expand the university, the funds for funding students, and the creation of the program for University for All, ProUni. So the number of higher education institutions increased by 76% in 2001 and 2017. If we consider only the federal public universities, the increase was 40%.
Estabelecidas para o período do Plano Nacional de Educação.
So the goals are not met just by this expansion. There is the need to continue to expand the expansion and more measures to combat. Next slide, please.
Das universidades federais de ensino superior na última década, dados reunidos pela
Data from the last century collected by Tatiana Silva
apontam que as mulheres
shows that women represent 54.6% of students,
uma presença superior à
which is higher than the demographics, the total population in Brazil. 56.5% receives minimum wage, up to minimum. Black students account for, well, it changed from 34.2 to 51.2 between 2003 and 2008. 1992, only 1.5 young Black people attended higher education, and in 2015, that number increased to 12.5%. So it's slow, but it's a significant change. Next slide, please. So we can see the change in the Black and white students in the Brazil. In 2017, the Black population
das pessoas com ensino superior concluído em contraste com 50.
Only 32% of people with higher education completed were Black, in contrast to 55% of Blacks in the next slide, please. So the gains, most important gains was,
ou seja, estamos falando da demonstração de força política dos movimentos sociais negros.
Okay, so the current government we're seeing, we are seeing a presidency that's trying to undo the work that has been done in past decades. So the law from 2012 has a long history in which it's possible to see that the political subject has been erased from representation.
Aos movimentos sociais, uma alteração da maneira como nós brasileiros lidamos
com there has been change on how we Brazilians see ourselves in the mirror. So it's not a case of adhering to the whitening project, but the idea to change the expectations about school. So it's not common anymore to hear, I finished my studies. But even when one is gone to the university, my generation would still say that. When we finished high school, we say, I finished my studies. That's what it meant. That sentence has gaining a different meaning now. But all of this is under threat. Next slide.
Affirmative action in higher education, é nítido que está em curso
desejo that there is a deliberate attempt to revert the policies of democratizing access to higher education in Brazil. Next slide. So the economy minister complained that even the son of a porter would be able to enter the university. So this was news from 2 weeks ago. Even the Ministry of Economy does not disguise his satisfaction, his dissatisfaction in seeing poor people entering the university.
Até mesmo justificado o fortalecimento de ataques à própria manutenção da oferta de ensino superior público.
So even the institution has been under attack, and the budget has been cut. The president of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro announced that the university is at risk of closing for lack of resources. So this is news from May 10th, 2 days ago. So this is a reality from different institutions. So there is the risk because the quota law, the affirmative action law that passed in 2012, is due for assessment and review in 2022. So it is fundamental that these policies continue. So to diminish the inequalities in Brazil. Without that, we run the risk of reverting to the beginning of the 20th century. Okay. We run the risk of all the affirmative action. Next slide. So I end by remembering the manifesto of the Black Coalition of Gaps. As long there is racism. So it's a challenge against the attempts to the current government institution. Okay, thank you. Obrigada.
Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Ms. Sharon Reid Davis, President of the Black Student Alliance at Michigan State University. She's a senior from Detroit, Michigan. She's studying political science, pre-law, human development, pre-law, and human development and family studies. And she has a minor in law, justice, and public policy. Sharon?
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Hi, everybody, and thank you to all the speakers that have spoken before me. I'm just going to keep my excuse me, section brief because I am feeling a little under the weather. So my two questions were about how to address racism and equity in the classroom and how to make student advocates and student leaders feel heard by the institution. So addressing race and equity issues in the classroom and community-wide should be a blatant effort. The problem with so many institutions is that the institution or the administration tries to ignore the problem until it's too late. They sweep it under the rug and they don't address the issue unless there's some type of media influence. I believe that addressing race and equity should just be put to the forefront just because it is simple to do so. If professors were able to have mandatory diversity and equity training available, I believe that this would be easier to do, especially in the classroom. Right now, there are very little mandatory diversity trainings for professors that are happening, and that is why there are so many problems that come out of the classroom when it comes to issues of race and equity. The institution and the systems in place are not built for Black people, and that's the truth. In order to fix the issues, that first needs to be acknowledged by leadership, the leadership of these institutions, the administration, the faculty, the staff. Then a real effort needs to be made to unlearn and reshape institutions and systems outside of the white supremacist lens that they were created in. There are racist people in these institutions that want to uphold these practices, and that's why the change is not happening. There are people that refuse to engage in the necessary conversations and unlearn the things that they were taught. there are people that still believe that Black lives don't matter. That's the truth. And until those people are weeded out of these systems and out of the leadership, there will always be a struggle for Black students in the Black community and people of color in general. An institutional goal should be to eradicate the need for student leadership in terms of students feeling like they have to fight for the basic rights like sense of belonging. The goal should be to have enough resources at these institutions to where students don't have to create their own advocacy organizations to meet their needs while not getting paid for it and being full-time students most of the time. Institutions should have enough staff and money to be able to create organizations with full-time staff employees to be able to advocate on behalf of students. The employees could even be the students so that it could be used as some type of work study or form of internship. To be honest, most diversity programming that happens at these institutions is done by students, is ran by students, is student-led, and students put their time, effort, and energy into this. This should not be happening. This should be paid work. Students are doing this, students like me are doing this full-time while being full-time students, some of the time having to work to pay just to attend these institutions. That doesn't make any sense. In order for students to actually feel like their voices have a meaningful impact in the world, they shouldn't be ignored when they want reasonable changes from institutions. To make student advocates, student leaders feel like they are heard and that we are listening to them, just simply listen, simply put plans and actions into actions, like turn plans into actions and just simply collaborate with the students. There is no reason that students should have to feel like they have to fight against the institutions that they reside. So simply listen, plan, and collaborate. If you listen to students, then they will feel heard. If you plan these things out, they will feel listened to. They will feel like you are, or the institution is with them. And if you collaborate instead of saying no or saying that this cannot happen because of these reasons, or just saying no without reasons, then that students wouldn't feel the need to rise up against these institutions. Students wouldn't feel like institutions are against them. Many times institutions feel the need to fight against student leaders and the wants and needs of students. And that's because, well, I'm not exactly sure because I'm not on the other side of it, but from my lens and my view, I feel that if institutions would adequately collaborate and be transparent about what is going on and be transparent about the rules and the processes of institutions, it will be much easier for students and administration of these institutions to work collaboratively to get things done. One example of this is a 10-point plan made by my organization, the Black Students Alliance, as well as a coalition of race and ethnic students and a coalition of progressive students on campus. This 10-point plan of demands for Michigan State University was basically just asking for different things for marginalized communities, asking for more gender inclusive housing and restrooms, asking for more reflection rooms and prayer rooms for different religions on campus, asking for the population of faculty and staff to reflect the population of East Lansing as far as race and ethnicity goes. A lot of these things were actually done. The reflection rooms were done. The gender inclusive housing and restrooms were done. But one thing that I noticed from this was that everything that was specifically for Black students was not completed. It made it seem like it was easier to get things for other marginalized communities and not the Black community, which is fine to a certain extent. But to make Black students feel like they belong, we have to get something as well, especially because Black students and Black people in general actively collaborate with everyone else and actively to put our needs to the back burner to help bring the needs forward of everyone else. True collaboration means that everyone is getting things done. Everyone is getting what they want. And institutions, they know this, and I believe that they actively work to make students feel as though they don't belong. I honestly believe that there are people inside of these administrations and inside of these institutions that don't want us here, that don't feel like we belong. And as I said before, until those people are weeded out of these systems, then we will never get a true sense of belonging, because there are people that feel like we shouldn't be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Monique Kelly. She is the Dean's Research Associate in the Department of Social, and she's in the Department of Sociology at Michigan State University. Dr. Kelly.
All right, so good morning, everyone. So just first, I would like to thank our hosts, the Alliance for African Partnership, and our co-hosts, MSU African Studies Center, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the Department of African American and African Studies for hosting this event. I would like to say thank you to Dr. Doug Bogie for his opening speech, and to our 5 panelists this morning for their spectacular talks. Their frank discussion of the nature and responses to racial injustice in Africa and the diaspora, especially as it relates to higher education, was fantastic and amply demonstrated the theme of this dialogue. From this talk, we have been able to gain some or more knowledge of the state of Blacks within varying contexts across the globe. Still on the first slide, please, highlighting how important having these discussions at all levels are, but more importantly, the work to better the educational experiences and outcomes of those of us within the African diaspora. Also, thank you to our moderators, to our audience for your presence, and lastly, thank you to our interpreters. Next slide, please. So as part of continuing this conversation and research, I would like to share our project that will soon be underway, being led by myself, along with Dr. Veni and Dr. Kamugisha as PIs. So this project is entitled Race, Ethnicity, and the Question of Post-Colonial Citizenship, a comparative study of East Africa and the Anglophone Caribbean, and has been funded by AAP as part of its Partnership for Innovative Research in Africa grants. So this study interrogates the legacy that colonialism left in its wake, which includes questions of internal class oppression, the intricacy of racial ethnic rivalries in the new nation, and the perpetuation of neocolonial forms of societal organization and relations within a capitalist world order. So using the cases of Barbados and Kenya, we will examine the role of race and ethnicity in circumscribing citizenship in the post-colonial state, and how it structures allocation of state resources as well as socioeconomic well-being. So this project is comparative between countries within 2 regions in the world subjected to British colonization, East Africa and the Anglophone Caribbean. So these 2 regions are widely separated by geographical distance and have different histories of formal colonization. So under British rule since the 17th century, which persisted until 1960s, Barbados was subjected to racial slavery and its aftermath over a century of subjecthood prior to universal adult suffrage in the mid-20th century. So despite the tremendous advances made over the last 70 years, the legacy of chattel slavery and the demoralization and impoverishment left in the wake of colonialism continue to haunt the socioeconomic order of the country. The most persistent public debates over the last generation have concerned race and the allocation of the country's economic wealth, or the concentration of wealth among a small minority ethnic class within the country. So while the broad socio-historical contours which have created this condition have been adequately mapped, little detailed empirical exploration of the allocation and distribution of resources has been done in the country over the last generation, which makes it a compelling candidate for research. The practice of post-colonial citizenship in East Africa has been fraught with civil unrest, internally displaced populations, and migration. It was clear before the countries gained their independence that citizenship was going to be a contested issue, with legacy of key political, social, and economic issues from the colonial era predicated on race and ethnicity haunting the post-colonial state. Although all of those who lived under colonial rule were subjects and not citizens, race, ethnicity, and region further exacerbated and often determined access to certain colonial benefits. The citizenship did not dramatically alter the status quo for many citizens who belonged to certain ethnic and racial groups. All right. So Barbados and Kenya possess intriguing similarities when the history of decolonization in both spaces is considered. Anti-colonial radicals and future state leaders from both regions worked in solidarity towards colonial freedom under the guise of global Pan-Africanism, particularly the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945, and later the first Pan-African Congress held on the African continent in Tanzania in 1974. And as recent important scholarship has shown, their post-colonial histories have also been intertwined via social, political, and cultural connections over the last 2 generations as independent countries. But despite this long history of connection, little recent work has been done on the complex questions of race, ethnicity, and post-colonial citizenship. So in an aim to move beyond contextual studies of these topics, we will utilize a mixed methodology, namely quantitative analysis and focus group interviews, to provide a more nuanced examination of the question of post-colonial citizenship. Next slide, please. So additionally, we would like to encourage like research on matters of race and ethnicity in the African diaspora. As such, AAP Perspectives is issuing a call for contributions from anywhere in the world that are short, critical reflections of issues around race and ethnicity in higher education institutions, as well as other key stakeholder organizations in Africa and African diaspora. The top piece will address the ways in which higher education institutions may unknowingly perpetuate structural racism, the current global race relations, and its role in increasing racist actions, and examine what should be done to create meaningful change. The specific issue that affects diaspora population, as well as the legacies of apartheid and colorism, and how they play out in the complex context of university policy, priorities will be included. Finally, we will also look at how faculty and students at universities are being prepared to address race and ethnicity issues in and outside the classroom, and the ways in which we must meaningfully ensure student voices and advocacy are part of the solution in institutional change. So call opens on June 1st. So again, if anyone is interested, be sure to be on the lookout for the call to submit possible work. So thank you all again for a wonderful, insightful, and engaging dialogue. We look forward to possible submissions to the special issue of AAP Perspectives. So I would like to end with a prompt that we not stop here, but continue this discussion, but more importantly, the work that needs to be done to challenge structures of race that constrain the chances and opportunities of those within the African diaspora. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kelly. And now we have time we have some questions in the Q&A, but unfortunately, we only have time for 2 questions. And these questions will be for anybody on the panel who would like to answer them. The first question is, if racism is the problem, who is most likely to provide a solution to the problem? Whites or Blacks or collectively? Again, if racism is the problem, who is most likely to provide a solution to the problem? Whites or Blacks or collectively? So I invite any of the panelists to our left to address the question, please.
If I may, Chair?
Yes.
To the extent that racism diminishes everyone, I think it should be a collective project. But of course, those people most adversely affected by racism will be more invested in finding a solution. Many of the changes that we have seen in society towards a more egalitarian, towards a more equal society, have been changes that have been brought about as a result of the, I suppose, the struggles and the endeavors of people who were affected most adversely by issues of racism. The long and short is, I think it's everyone's responsibility, but as things play themselves out, it is those people who are most adversely affected who will push strongest for a transformation of our society.
Thank you very much. Okay, our next question is a little lengthy, so I'll go over it really fast, but it's addressing our topic today of higher education. Higher education institutions accommodate students from diversified backgrounds and ethnic groups. However, compared to other areas and institutions, the tension is very high. Why these? Does it mean exposure and engagement with diversified situation don't play significant roles in reducing the negative effects? What kinds of strategies are effective and what kinds of actions are necessary to be taken by key parties involved? And I'll leave it at that. Because I'll leave it at that. So is there anybody who would like to answer that? And I think that's all we're going to have time for.
Could you repeat the question?
I said it real fast. Higher education institutions accommodate students from diversified backgrounds and ethnic groups. However, compared to other areas and institutions, the tension is very high. Why these? Does it mean exposure and engagement with diversified situations don't play significant roles in reducing the negative effects? What kinds of strategies are effective and what kinds of actions are necessary to be taken by key parties involved? Is there anybody who would like to answer that quickly?
If no one else has anything to add, I'll just say to this, in many of our institutions, such as Michigan State University, that's predominantly white, I think when people don't understand the history and the experience of Black people and people of color within those spaces, they may not necessarily understand or embrace the need to institute particular interventions to ensure that these individuals, so that we feel safe, that we feel supported, and feel welcome on campuses. So I think providing awareness around who all the various members of the campus community are, the history related to members' access to and I guess advancement in these institutions. So the pushback often comes, I think, because of a lack of awareness and a lack of understanding and the need and responsibility of institutions to ensure that they are open environments that will provide access to various resources and opportunities for everyone, despite historical challenges and despite things that we've talked about here today, such as even laws that have prevented people in the past, Black people and across diaspora, for accessing education, but also opportunities beyond the college and university environment.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would imagine I'm going to turn it back over to somebody from Michigan State University to wrap it up.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you very much for attending today's dialogue on race and ethnicity in Africa and the African diaspora. We'd like to invite you to attend our next dialogue, which will be held on Wednesday, 9th June. And the topic is Pathways to Resilience, African Youth and Africa's Transformation. We'll send those details to all of you. We hope to see you then, and thank you so much. Bye.